Stories about zombies have existed in folklore for hundreds of years, and many of the people who first began telling and retelling these stories may have genuinely believed that zombies or something like them existed. So for them, it represented a very real fear, and we can understand why they would have been fascinated by stories about zombies and wanting to spread the word. But why, hundreds of years later, do we continue to retell these stories, to make TV shows, to make movies about them, to make video games galore about them? And why do they continue to scare us when we know that the stories are fictional, when we know that the beings represented aren't real? Horror movies are full of supernatural, fantastical beings that we don't believe in, and yet they still manage to get us. Are you scared of the zombies? I know, they're terrifying. Part of the reason for that is that these figures represent something. They symbolize something in the real world, in our world, that we are afraid of, or at least anxious about. They give our fears form and embodiment and force us to confront them. So as we analyze these figures, one of the things that we want to look for is what is it that they are evoking or referencing or calling up, maybe even at a subconscious level in us, that does produce those responses of fear and anxiety. We want to look at the specific features that these creatures are given and think about what that might correspond to in the world of the audience. So let's take a closer look at this opening scene from Night of the Living Dead. So we start with this long shot of a winding road, and we watch the car that Johnny and Barbara are driving come up from the distance, way at the very, very back of the shot. And this accomplishes a couple things. For one, it clues us into how isolated they are in this area. So it's really setting up the plot of what's going to happen in the story later. But it also has two other effects. First of all, the first human characters we see appear as teeny tiny little specks in the scale of this frame, and only gradually do they get closer and bigger, but it really gives us a sense of how vulnerable and weak human beings are in comparison to the scope of nature, in comparison to the scope of powers that are much bigger than they are. The other thing that this opening does is, because we start and we watch them drive this whole road, it's really playing with pacing here. It takes a long time for that car to finally get up to the graveyard, and at the same time all of this ominous music is playing. And so there's really an intent to build suspense all through this opening scene, and it's cluing us into the fact that suspense, playing with time, playing with waiting, is going to be really important in the rest of the film.
Now, we've still got a 3-hour drive back. We're not going to be home until after midnight.
Well, if it really bugged you, Johnny, you wouldn't do it.
You think I want to blow Sunday on a scene like this? Look at this thing. We still remember. I don't. I don't even remember what the man looks like.
Johnny, it takes you 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes to put the wreath on the grave and 6 hours to drive back and forth. Mother wants to remember, so we trot 200 miles into the country and she stays at home.
Few things going on here. For one, we see them sitting in the car to have this extended conversation. And part of what that does is it, again, kind of makes us notice the car space a lot more, which is going to become important by the end of this scene, as you know. And it shows that we have this signifier of normalcy, right? The car, the brother and sister, they're having a little bit of an argument, they're driving around. It feels very normal, very everyday. And then that car is really emblematic of that everydayness, because cars are such a sort of latent part of our everyday lives. We use them all the time. We see them all the time. We don't really think about them. And then suddenly, at the end of the scene, that is going to be flipped on its head, right? The thing that was so normal and so banal is suddenly going to become the site of such terror. And it really is emphasizing the idea of how the world gets sort of turned upside down in the film. The other thing that I think is really interesting in this scene is that it introduces this idea of respect for the dead and how the living relate to the dead. And in a story that's all about the living dead and the dead sort of coming back and forcing the living to take account of them and to be accountable to them, I think that's a really, really interesting choice. And of course, Johnny, who doesn't have respect for the dead, who doesn't care about his dead father, who's not interested in remembering him, he ends up being the first one who gets cut down by the dead coming to take their revenge. So there's an interesting meditation here about, the importance of the dead and how, the dead will make themselves remembered. They're never really dead and gone. And I think that is very frequently caught up with the whole symbology of zombies.
I wonder what happened to the one from last year. Each year we spend good money on these things. We come out here and the one from last year's gone.
Well, the flowers die, and the caretaker or somebody takes them away.
Yeah, a little spit and polish. You can clean this up. Sell it next year. Wonder how many times we bought the same one.
So again, we have a variation on the same theme, right? The idea of death not being respected, but being commodified. It touches again on that fear or that anxiety that's connected with how the living relate to the dead, and the idea of all of this angst that's bound up with when someone that we love dies, are they still going to stick around and haunt us and make themselves felt? Are we going to be able to move on? And that fear, on the other hand, we have the reverse fear, which is the fear of forgetting and the fear of, not doing that person justice. And I think all of that gets wrapped up in all of these stories that have to do with the undead returning. And that's something that is actually a very common motif in zombie stories, is a moment when one of the characters has to confront a loved one who has been turned into a zombie.
Look, there comes one of them now.
He'll hear you.
Here he comes now. I'm getting out of here.
Johnny.
So we get our first look at the living dead, but what I find so interesting is that this figure doesn't necessarily look at the outset like a zombie or really anything particularly monstrous. What we're going to see throughout the film is that the zombies seem to be in sort of varying states of decay, but this guy looks pretty fresh. His clothes are a little ripped, but we wouldn't necessarily know, I think, that he was a zombie just by looking at him, especially when we first see him. He kind of looks like he could just be a random guy. And so when he first comes up and grabs Barbara, if we didn't know what was coming, if we didn't know that we were expecting a zombie to show up in this graveyard, it might look like she's simply being assaulted by any man. And I think, again, that's a really interesting image to evoke, right? To evoke a more everyday fear, a concern about crime, a concern about being victimized. And that gets wrapped up again here. And especially, we get a lot of this sort of damsel in distress imagery, Barbara running and tripping and falling, and she's got the heels on. Why do you wear heels? And now, trying to lock herself and hide in the car. So there's a lot here being shown about the sort of violence and then Barbara's, quote unquote, feminine weakness and vulnerability to being victimized by this guy. And again, I think that the undertones of, the disturbing undertones of that are to a certain extent intentional, and they're wrapping up a lot of different kinds of fears and discomfort into this one scene, because what we frequently see with figures like this that are sort of human, sort of not, right? Zombies, vampires, and so forth. A lot of what's being explored there is the limits of humanity, right? The limits of our own humanity. At what point do we become not human anymore? And that's part of what's so disturbing about the zombie, is that it's something that looks human and yet maybe doesn't have the human capacity for thought, rational reflection, doesn't have the human capacity for empathy, certainly, and is driven only by instinct and by need and by appetite. And so the idea of uncontrolled appetite and uncontrolled human drives is something that's really scary, because we do link that to crime and depravity and all the terrible things that human beings can do to each other. And a lot of times when we imagine these things that kind of look like humans menacing us or being dangerous, part of what we're trying to work through is really that whole question of, the human capacity to hurt other people, and the human capacity to be immoral ultimately.